The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer, same as they had for 3 years. Margaret Walsh moved through the corridors of Sacred Heart Hospital like water finding its level, no splash, no disturbance, just presence. She had been invisible for 1,095 days, and that was precisely the point. Her hands knew the work. For lines threaded into collapsed veins like she'd done it 1,000 times, which she had. Not here. Before. She never spoke about before. Her locker contained a single photograph, her daughter at 19, smiling in front of a cabin in the Cascades, and a thermos of black coffee, always empty by midnight. The other nurses didn't ask questions about the gaps in her resume. Sacred Heart didn't ask many questions about anyone. It was the kind of hospital that took what it could get. The night shift suited her. Fewer people. Fewer voices rising and falling like gunfire. The antiseptic smell of the ER mixed with something underneath it, decay, fear, the smell of bodies breaking down on their own schedule. She could work in that smell without flinching. Smells were just information. Dr. Sterling had arrived 3 months ago from some private practice in Seattle, and he moved through Sacred Heart like he owned the deed. Expensive watch. Silk tie. The kind of surgeon who believed that confidence and a medical degree were the same thing as competence. He was not the worst of his kind. That distinction belonged to men who hurt people on purpose. Sterling just hurt people through carelessness and arrogance, which was somehow worse because it felt preventable. Margaret had corrected him twice in her first week. She hadn't meant to. The first time, she'd simply mentioned that the heparin bolus dosage for the post-op cardiac patient was running at twice the protocol rate. The second time, she'd caught him ordering a morphine drip for a trauma admission that would have dropped the man's respirations into dangerous territory. Both times, Sterling had listened, made the adjustment, and moved on without acknowledgement. That was how it worked in most hospitals. The nurses caught the errors, the doctors accepted the correction, and everyone pretended it hadn't happened. Sterling didn't seem to understand this unwritten code. On a Tuesday night in November, the ambulance brought in a John Doe from downtown Portland, pulled out of an alley near the waterfront at 2:14 a.m. Male, approximately 60 years old, no identification on his person, no wallet, no phone. His vitals were weak but stable, blood pressure 94/62, heart rate steady at 68, oxygen saturation holding at 91% on room air. He wore clothes that had seen better decades, a canvas jacket with torn seams, thermal underneath, jeans stained with something dark that might have been blood or might have been time. Margaret settled him in room for 47, checking the 4-line that had been placed in the ambulance, monitoring the steady beep of the cardiac monitor. The rhythm looked clean. Sinus rhythm, regular as a heartbeat should be. His face was weathered the way faces get weathered, not from age alone but from exposure to elements that broke down the soft parts. She'd seen that kind of weathering before. She knew what kind of years carved that particular map into a man's face. While adjusting the blanket across his chest, her fingers caught on the inside edge of his jacket, hanging on the chair beside the bed. The seam was deteriorating, and something was sewn into the lining, fabric, not random. She pulled the jacket closer and looked at the stitching. It was deliberate. Careful. The kind of stitching a person does in quiet moments, knowing exactly why. The fabric was a patch. Military unit patch. Faded from years of being hidden, the colors muted but still visible, a Ranger tab. Her hands went still. Her breathing went still. 3 seconds passed, and in those 3 seconds, the hospital noise outside the room seemed to drain away, the fluorescent hum, the distant call button, the squeak of the stretcher wheels down the corridor. Just her and the patch and the feeling that the ground had shifted 2 inches to the left. She searched the jacket more carefully, her fingers moving along the seams like she was reading Braille. The hidden pocket was in the lining itself, stitched closed, but the stitching had loosened with age. She found it. Inside was a military ID card, laminated, the image slightly faded. Captain James Holland. 75th Ranger Regiment. Date of birth, 1962. The photograph showed a younger man, not young, but younger, with the kind of face that followed orders without question. James Holland. Her son's commanding officer. The man who had written the letter. Margaret set the ID down on the bedside table and stood very still for 20 seconds. The monitor beeped. The four-pump hummed. The ventilation system cycled air through the room like the hospital was breathing for all of them. She could feel her pulse in her neck, feel the electrical charge running through her nervous system the way it always did when something tried to crack the shell she'd built. But she didn't move. Didn't breathe harder. Didn't let anything show on her face. The letter had arrived 6 years ago, handwritten on military letterhead, explaining that Petty Officer First Class Michael Walsh had been killed in action in Helmand Province on March 14th. That he had died under Captain James Holland's command. That he had been a good man and a good soldier. That the captain was sorry. She had read the letter once. Then she had burned it. The door to room for 47 opened without a knock. Dr. Sterling stepped in, his eyes moving from the patient to Margaret and then to her hands, which were still touching the jacket. His expression shifted, not visibly to a casual observer, but Margaret had trained herself to read the micro-expressions that told the truth. A tightening at the corners of his mouth. A slight contraction of his pupils. The flash of something that looked like suspicion. Patient belongings are catalogued by admitting, he said. His voice had the tone of a man stating obvious fact. You shouldn't be going through them without authorization. I was adjusting his blanket, Margaret said. The jacket was in the way. I felt something in the lining. Sterling walked over and took the jacket from her, his movements carrying the weight of authority. He found the hidden pocket exactly as she had. The ID card slipped into his palm. He read the name, the unit designation, the dates. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, recognition, perhaps. Or calculation. Military, he said. Appears so. Well, that gets documented and handed to the VA when he wakes up. Sterling set the card on the bedside table with the kind of precise placement that suggested he was filing information away. Or if he wakes up. CT didn't show trauma, but he's been down for at least 12 hours before transport. Hypoxia causes damage that scans can't always predict. Margaret said nothing. She was looking at the patient's face, at the weathered map of it, at the way his chest rose and fell with the mechanical precision of a body that was alive but not awake. Somewhere in that head, under all that damage and time, James Holland was still there. You know, Sterling said, and his tone had shifted into something conversational, it's interesting. You have a very steady hand with foreplacement. Very assured. Most nurses your age, you see some hesitation. You don't hesitate. Experience, Margaret said. What kind of experience, exactly? Your resume shows a gap. Significant gap. 11 years. Then you show up at Sacred Heart with 3 years of solid work but no references before that. He was still holding the military ID, turning it over in his fingers. No previous employers listed. Nothing. I worked private care for a long time, Margaret said. Families don't always provide formal references. Sterling tucked the ID into his pocket. Well, we'll verify your credentials with the state licensing board. Just routine. Everyone gets verified eventually. He left the room, and Margaret stood alone with Captain James Holland and the sound of the monitor tracking his heartbeat. Each beep was a moment he'd survived something. Each beep was another second where the past wasn't supposed to walk through the door. She had come to Sacred Heart to disappear. She had come with nothing but a new resume and a thermos and a new way of holding her face so nobody could see the things she'd seen. For 3 years, it had worked. The hospital had asked nothing. The nurses had accepted her as just another older woman trying to make rent, pushing a med cart through the fluorescent dark. But the past didn't respect boundaries. The past didn't understand that some people had paid their debts in blood and silence and didn't want the interest compounded. The monitor beeped. Captain Holland's oxygen saturation held steady at 92%. His blood pressure was still 94/62. His body was surviving. His mind was somewhere else entirely. And Margaret Walsh stood beside his bed, her hand steady, her face calm, knowing that everything she'd built was about to come down, not because she'd made a mistake, but because the universe had a sense of irony that cut like a scalpel. She had come to the hospital to save lives without being asked who she'd been when she was doing it for real. Now the hospital had brought her a life to save. And that life was tied to every reason she'd disappeared in the first place. She checked his full line one more time, adjusted the blanket, made a note in his chart. The motions were automatic. The composure was automatic. The absence of feeling was automatic. But underneath the automation, in the place where she kept the things that couldn't break her anymore, something had shifted. Something that felt like the ground opening up beneath her feet, and a voice from 6 years ago saying the word she'd never wanted to hear again, "I'm sorry about your son." The morning rounds at Sacred Heart started at 6:15, when the fluorescent lights flickered on in the ICU and the machines began their synchronized breathing. Margaret had positioned herself at the medication cart, checking Captain Holland's for lines with the same methodical precision she'd used on wounded Marines in field hospitals across Helmand province. Her hands moved on muscle memory, but her mind was elsewhere, caught between the man in room for 47 and the ghost of a letter she'd burned 6 years ago, the one that explained why her son wouldn't be coming home. Dr. Sterling arrived at 6:45, his Italian loafers clicking across the tile floor like a countdown timer. He was already reviewing charts with his usual performative confidence, that particular brand of arrogance that came from inheriting prestige rather than earning it. Margaret had learned to recognize the type during her 23 years of service, officers who mistook authority for competence, who believed rank was permission to be reckless. Sterling rounded the corner near the nurses' station where Margaret was updating Holland's chart, his voice carrying the particular timbre of someone addressing an audience, not a colleague. "I'm making a bet right now," he announced, his eyes finding hers across the counter. "Anyone want in? Walsh here won't last the week. She's got that look, you know, the kind that folds under real pressure." The younger nurses stopped typing. One resident looked up from her tablet. Sterling's smile was a weapon, polished and cruel, the kind of smile a man uses when he knows the room will laugh with him, not at him. Margaret met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then returned to Holland's chart. One measured breath. That was all she allowed herself. No tremor in her hands. No color rising in her cheeks. Just the steady documentation of vital signs, blood pressure stable, oxygen saturation climbing, heart rate showing the faint electrical signature of a man pulling back from the edge. "I give her until Friday," Sterling continued, his voice pitched to carry. "Friday at the latest. Call it professional intuition." The younger nurses smiled nervously. One even laughed, a junior RN named Tyler who hadn't yet learned that laughing at someone's pain teaches you nothing about the person being mocked. It teaches you about yourself. Margaret wrote the note and closed the chart with deliberate care. She clipped her pen back to her scrub pocket and moved to the next patient's room. Behind her, she heard Sterling say something about old dogs and new tricks, but the words didn't stick. She'd survived worse than Sterling's contempt. She'd watched men die because of contempt. She'd lived through the consequences. 2 days later, the cafeteria was crowded with the lunch rush, the organized chaos of a hospital feeding its staff in tight shifts. Margaret carried her tray carefully, a sandwich, a cup of tomato soup, a bottle of water, an apple. Simple fuel. She'd learned long ago not to eat when she was stressed, the food would sit in her stomach like a stone. But she forced herself anyway. The routine mattered. The normalcy mattered. It was what kept the past contained. She was passing Sterling's table, where he sat with 2 of his attendings and a pharmaceutical rep in a tailored blazer, when his elbow rose like a practice gesture. It looked almost accidental, the kind of small movement that could be mistaken for a shift in his chair. But Margaret had spent 23 years reading violence in its minor variations, in the microsecond before things escalated. She saw the deliberation in his shoulder, the control in the arc of his arm. The tray fell from her hands. The soup bowl shattered across the tile floor with a sound like breaking glass, and suddenly there was red liquid spreading across the white floor and her sandwich on top of the mess and coffee dripping from the edge of the counter. 40 staff members watched. The clattering of silverware stopped. The beep of the cashier paused. The world held its breath. Butterfingers, Walsh, Sterling said, his voice carrying easily through the silence. His attending smiled. Maybe nursing isn't for you. She knelt to pick up the pieces. The broken ceramic was sharp against her fingers, she could feel the edge cutting slightly, a small line of pain that anchored her. Pain was data. Pain meant she was still here, still present, still functional. One tear escaped as she gathered the pieces of the bowl. It ran down her cheek like a defeat, like proof that he was right, that she didn't belong here. She let it fall and did not wipe it away immediately. She wanted him to see it. She wanted everyone to see it. And then, with her movement still deliberate, still controlled, she wiped the tear away with the back of her hand and made eye contact with Sterling, not defiant, not challenging, just level and clear. She didn't need to say anything. Not yet. She cleaned the mess alone while the room resumed its normal sounds, conversations resuming, silverware clinking, the hum of the soft-serve machine. Sterling had already turned back to his pharmaceutical rep, his point made. The younger nurses looked away. That was the thing about public humiliation, it worked because most people would rather preserve their comfort than acknowledge it was happening. Easier to look away than to become targets themselves. Margaret disposed of the broken bowl in the trash and returned to the line to get another lunch she didn't want. The apple was still fine. She'd eat that, at least. The next morning, the chart came at her like a thrown object, which meant it was exactly that, a thrown object. Sterling had caught her outside room for 47, where Holland lay still connected to monitors that tracked every chemical conversation his body was having with itself. The chart scattered across the floor, individual pages spinning like confetti, data spreading across the tile in patterns that meant everything to no one but her. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice smooth as oil. His resident stood beside him, watching with the expression of someone learning how power actually worked. "And next time, don't question my morphine dosage in front of residents. You're a nurse. I'm a doctor. Know your place." Margaret knelt slowly. She gathered each page with deliberate care, assembling them into the correct order because that's what you did, you restored order even when someone was trying to create chaos. She straightened, made eye contact with Sterling, and spoke in a voice like stone, each word sharpened on years of experience that he couldn't begin to measure. "I've picked up better men than you from worse places than this floor." The words hung in the corridor air. Behind her, the machines beeped their steady rhythm. Holland's ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath. Sterling's smile froze for one moment, not a long moment, but long enough for everyone to see it wasn't genuine anymore. Then it returned, twice as cold, and his eyes narrowed to something more calculating. "Document everything she does," he told his resident quietly. "Every medication, every decision, every time she deviates from protocol. I want it all noted." Then he turned back to his rounds, his loafers clicking away down the corridor. Margaret held the reassembled chart against her chest. The pages were still warm from the floor, still carrying the faint smell of hospital linoleum and industrial cleaner. What Sterling didn't understand was that she'd already survived the worst thing that could happen to a person. She'd received a letter explaining her son's death, had read the words written by the commanding officer of the boy she'd raised to be brave. Captain James Holland, whose name was now on a door in room for 47, unconscious and connected to machines, was the man who'd written those words. And now Sterling was going to investigate her, was going to dig through her employment history and her sparse references and the 10-year gap in her work record that she'd never explained to anyone, the years she'd spent in uniform, carrying weapons instead of stethoscopes, learning how to break things instead of heal them. She returned to her charting station and continued her shift. But that evening, when she locked the chart in the secure cabinet, something had shifted. Sterling had made his first real move. He decided she was a threat worth eliminating, which meant he decided she was significant enough to threaten. The quiet was ending. The investigation started silently, the way most institutional violence begins, with phone calls made from an office with a closed door. Sterling contacted the hospital board, spoke with carefully chosen words to people who trusted him, planted the seeds of doubt about credential verification and employment gaps. He activated relationships built over years of golf outings and hospital galas, weaponizing his own institutional position like a surgeon with a scalpel. By the end of the week, an external investigator showed up during Margaret's shift, a thin man in a grey suit who carried a leather portfolio and asked questions about her training, her certifications, the years between her high school graduation and her nursing degree. Margaret answered with the minimum required detail, offering nothing about the Naval Officer Training Command, the SEAL qualification training, the classified operations across Helmand Province where she'd learned medicine in the worst possible classroom. Significant employment gap here, the investigator noted, pointing at her application. 10 years between your discharge from, he squinted at the paperwork, various positions, and your enrollment in nursing school. Can you explain that? Personal reasons, Margaret said. I was dealing with some health issues. He made a note. That was the trap, she realized. The more you explained, the more you lied. The more you lied, the more they dug. It was better to say nothing and let silence be its own kind of answer. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table while Emma practiced her spelling words in the next room. Her daughter had asked why Mom seemed tired, if work was okay. Margaret had smiled, the mask dropping back into place, and said it was just a long shift. She didn't tell Emma about Sterling, about the investigation, about the faded unit patch sewn into a dead man's jacket or the living man upstairs who might recognize her name if he ever woke up. She stared at her coffee, now cold, and listened to the rain beginning to hammer the Portland streets outside. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. A Navy Cross citation that mentioned her name, though she'd never said it out loud to anyone since she'd stopped wearing the uniform. And now Sterling was about to find every trace of that life, was going to pull the loose thread and watch everything unravel. Dr. Sterling made the first call at 8:44 p.m. from his office, the one with the mahogany desk and the Harvard Medical School diploma framed in genuine leather. His fingers moved across the phone with the precision of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. The country club membership list was open on his computer, 3 names, 3 men who sat beside him at the 19th hole every other Saturday, men who understood how the world worked, men who had daughters at Dalton and sons at Princeton. The first call took for minutes. Sterling's voice never rose above a murmur, but each word carried the weight of institutional pressure. He wasn't asking questions about Margaret's credentials. He was planting them. Did you notice any gaps in her timeline? Particularly around the years 2010 to 2014? I'm simply trying to conduct due diligence. The board member on the other end, a cardiologist named Hayes who kept a second home in Cabo, didn't ask why. Men like Sterling didn't need to explain themselves. Hayes promised he'd mention it at the next board meeting, said something about how you could never be too careful these days, said he'd call around. The second call came at 9:03 p.m. The third at 9:19 p.m. By the time Sterling hung up the phone, he'd planted the seed in soil that had been prepared for exactly this kind of growth. 3 board members. 3 whispered concerns. 3 promises to ask the right questions in the right rooms. Then came the references. Margaret had listed 4, the charge nurse supervisor from her previous position at a community health clinic in Corvallis, an attending physician from a rural urgent care facility in Eugene, and 2 volunteer coordinators from a nonprofit in Salem. Sterling had them all within the hour. His assistant pulled the numbers, and Sterling made the calls himself, each one methodical, each one poisoned by the careful architecture of his questions. He never asked directly about Margaret's work history. Instead, he asked around it, creating the impression of a known problem he was simply confirming. When you worked with Ms. Walsh, did you ever notice anything unusual about her employment timeline? Any periods of time unaccounted for? I ask because we're conducting a thorough background check for patient safety reasons, you understand. One of the references, the charge nurse supervisor named Patricia, hesitated just long enough for Sterling to hear the hesitation. There were gaps, yes. Margaret had left suddenly in 2010 and didn't resurface until 2013. 3 years. No forwarding address. No explanation. Patricia didn't know where she'd gone or why she'd left in the middle of a shift on a Tuesday. All she knew was that Margaret had come back quiet, different, moving through her shifts like someone who'd learned to disappear. Sterling pressed gently. Did she seem unstable during that period? Any indication of mental health issues? Patricia's voice tightened. She's one of the best nurses I've ever worked with. She saved a man's life during a shift once, never even told anyone about it. Sterling smiled into the darkness of his office. Mental health issues. That was the thread. That was the narrative that would unravel everything. By the time he hung up, Sterling had what he needed, a timeline with holes big enough to fit a narrative through, a story that suggested instability, possible falsified credentials, maybe even fabricated nursing certifications obtained during the missing years. The investigator arrived at Sacred Heart on Thursday morning at 7:15 a.m., before the day shift started, which meant Margaret saw him walking through the hallway with a folder and a badge that read, Credentials Verification Services. His name was Driscoll, and he had the kind of face that smiled without warmth. Sterling had used him before, a man who understood that his job was less about finding the truth and more about building a case. Driscoll spent 6 hours in the hospital's administrative office, requesting files, cross-referencing dates, pulling Margaret's initial hiring paperwork from 3 years ago, comparing it against the State Nursing Board database. The work was methodical. The work was thorough. The work was designed to look fair while building a weapon. By noon, Driscoll had flagged 7 inconsistencies. The gaps in employment history. A 3-year period with no documented work history. References that were vague when pressed about specific patient outcomes. Questions about the legitimacy of certain medical procedures she'd performed with a level of competence that seemed inconsistent with someone who'd been out of the field for 3 years. He didn't find falsified documents, there were none to find, but he found questions. In Sterling's experience, questions were better than proof. Questions lived in people's minds. Questions spread like a virus through a workplace. Questions made people wonder. Questions made people doubt. The charge nurse, Sandra, was apologetic when she found Margaret at 3:16 p.m. Her face carried the weight of institutional obligation. Your badge has been deactivated. Dr. Sterling's orders. There's an investigator reviewing your credentials. I'm so sorry. I'm sure it's just a routine thing. Margaret didn't ask questions. She'd spent 20 years in environments where orders came down and you executed them. She'd learned that resistance in the moment only slowed the inevitable. She removed her badge from around her neck, the one that had admitted her to every unit in the hospital for 3 years, and set it on the counter beside Sandra's station. Her hands were steady. Her face was blank. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their electric hymn, indifferent to the moment, indifferent to Margaret's removal from the hospital floor where Captain Holland was lying in room for 47 with a blood pressure that was still dropping, with a heart that was still struggling, with a man who didn't know that the senior chief petty officer who'd found his military ID was about to be removed from his care. Sterling appeared in the hallway at 4:22 p.m., satisfied, moving with the particular confidence of a man who'd already won. He didn't speak to Margaret. He didn't need to. The removal of her badge was language enough. The badge was her presence. Without it, she was invisible. Margaret drove home in the rain. Portland in November was a city that never fully dried, a place where the sky hung low and grey and the streets reflected the clouds like dark mirrors. She'd taken the same route 1,000 times, southeast Hawthorne, across the Burnside Bridge, into northwest residential, the tree-lined streets where her apartment building sat like a patient waiting for diagnosis. The rain hammered the windshield in waves, and the wipers beat their rhythm, on-off, on-off, on-off. She didn't think about Captain Holland. She didn't think about cardiac tamponade or Beck's triad or the blood pressure readings that meant a man was running out of time. She didn't think about Sterling or the investigator or the badge now locked in a drawer at the hospital. She thought about her hands on the steering wheel, about the muscle memory that never left, about how it felt to hold something fragile and keep it alive. Her daughter, Emma, was waiting when Margaret came through the apartment door. Emma was 23, worked retail at a mall downtown, had questions about everything her mother never answered. Margaret still had her scrubs on, powder blue, now damp with rain, the fabric clinging to her like a second skin. The apartment smelled like old coffee and the lavender sachets Emma had hung in the bedroom closet. Emma took one look at her mother's face and knew. She was sitting at the kitchen table, the one where Margaret had taught her to cook when she was 9, the one where they'd traced her son's unit patch with their fingers before he deployed. Emma's voice came out small, fragile as broken glass. "Mom, why are you home early?" Margaret sat down at the table without removing her scrubs. The fabric made a soft whispering sound as she settled into the chair. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she noticed they were trembling, not from fear, but from the particular restraint that comes from knowing you cannot move, cannot act, cannot do the thing your entire military training has taught you to do. She looked at her daughter's face and saw the moment Emma understood that something had changed. The table between them held 20 years of weight, the weight of secrets, the weight of the missing years, the weight of a son who died in a place Margaret had spent 2 decades learning to survive. Outside, thunder rolled across the city like distant artillery fire. Rain hammered against the windows. And Margaret opened her mouth to explain that she'd been fired, that her credentials were under investigation, that a man was dying in a hospital room 45 minutes away and she was powerless to save him, that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes not guns, and sometimes even that isn't enough. Her daughter's question hung in the rain-soaked kitchen like something that couldn't be taken back. Margaret's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of 3 years of lies folding in on themselves. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Then her phone buzzed. A text from Sacred Heart: Captain Holland's vitals were deteriorating. BP dropping. Heart rate climbing toward 140. Jugular veins distending like rope beneath his skin. She knew what that meant. Pericardial effusion. The blood pooling around his heart, suffocating it with every beat. Field medicine from Helmand Province doesn't forget those signs, the compression that kills quietly, that looks like nothing until the patient codes. Margaret's daughter was still standing there, waiting for an answer, and Margaret was calculating how long it would take to get back to the hospital. Emma's voice came small and fractured. "Mom, I have to go back. You said you were fired." "I know what I said." Margaret grabbed her rain jacket without changing out of her scrubs. The drive took 17 minutes instead of 23. Red lights became suggestions. The rain hammered the windshield like it was trying to get inside, like it knew something was dying across the city. She parked in the employee lot even though her badge wouldn't open the doors anymore, even though security would probably stop her, even though she had nothing to offer anymore except the thing she'd buried so deep that even her daughter didn't know it existed. But at 2:17 a.m., that's exactly what she got. The code blue alarm didn't sound like a normal alarm. It screamed. Room for 47. 3rd floor. Margaret heard it from the parking lot where rain was pooling around her boots. She didn't think. Her body remembered what her mind wanted to forget. The sound of that particular alarm meant someone's heart was trying to die. She moved toward the entrance, and a security guard she didn't recognize stepped forward, his hand rising. You can't." She didn't slow down. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, Sacred Heart Emergency Privileges, Medical Crisis Protocol. The words came out in the voice of someone who'd given orders under fire. Not a question. Not a request. The guard's jaw tightened and he stepped aside. Her ID wouldn't work, but the door was being held by a terrified resident carrying a crash cart, and she slipped through behind him. The stairs were 3 flights. She took them 2 at a time, her hospital badge bouncing against her chest like a metronome counting down to something irreversible. Room for 47 was chaos and controlled panic. The resident was doing chest compressions on Captain Holland. The monitor showed PA, pulseless electrical activity. The flat line of electricity without the muscle behind it. 2 nurses were pushing epinephrine. Nobody was thinking. Nobody was seeing what was actually happening. Margaret was in the room before anyone noticed her. "Stop compressions," she said. The resident looked up, furious. "Who the hell? Transesophageal echo. Stat." Her voice had that particular quality, the one that comes from having made decisions that got people killed or saved them, no middle ground. The ultrasound tech was frozen by the monitors. Margaret grabbed the wand herself, placed it, and there it was, a massive dark pool surrounding the heart like an executioner's hand. Pericardial effusion. Maybe 800 milliliters of fluid pressing down on the myocardium, squeezing it into silence. The reason a ranger's heart was forgetting how to beat. She didn't ask for permission. She moved to the crash cart and pulled the pericardiocentesis kit with movements that felt like muscle memory returning from the dead. 18-gauge needle. Syringe. The alcohol swab across Holland's skin, she could smell the iodine, sharp and clinical, the same smell from a dozen field hospitals where the lights ran on generators and the only sterile thing was the certainty that speed was survival. Below the xiphoid process. Advance slowly. Angle toward the left shoulder. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, his mouth opening to issue commands, but Margaret was already pressing forward. The needle advanced through skin and muscle and pericardium, that final membrane, and she felt the tiny popper breaking through into the space where Holland's heart was drowning. She pulled back on the plunger. Dark blood filled the syringe. 60 milliliters came free like a release valve finally opening. Holland gasped. It wasn't a breathing gasp. It was the gasp of a heart suddenly able to expand, suddenly freed from the weight pressing down on it. His monitor shifted. Sinus rhythm began climbing back into territory that meant living. His blood pressure climbed. His oxygen saturation found itself again. The color returned to his face like someone had turned the volume up on his life. Margaret withdrew the needle, applied pressure with a sterile gauze pad, and only then, only in that single second when Holland was breathing again, her hand started to shake. Not from fear. From the knowledge of what she'd just done. From the certainty that a procedure performed without physician authorization, without even being credentialed as a nurse at this hospital anymore, was going to end everything she'd rebuilt. Sterling's voice came from the doorway like a death sentence pronounced slowly. "You just performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. You're done." Margaret didn't look at him. She was watching Holland's chest rise and fall, watching the monitor climb into numbers that meant survival, watching the resident's face transform from panic into something resembling comprehension. The decision had been made in a single beat of her own heart. Save the ranger. End everything else. By noon, her badge was deactivated. Sterling had filed formal complaints, unauthorized procedures, credentialing irregularities, insubordination, practicing medicine without a license. The hospital's legal team had circled. Her references had been weaponized. An investigator's report had materialized with damning inconsistencies, gaps in employment history, certification discrepancies, a nursing license that somehow had survived 20 years in a system that should have flagged her real background decades ago. Security escorted her out at 11:53 a.m. while the day shift watched. Some nurses looked away. Others, the ones Margaret had trained, the ones she'd saved from mistakes, the ones who'd learned what competence actually looked like, pulled out their phones. Margaret walked between them carrying a cardboard box containing 3 years of quiet, her spare stethoscope, a thermal coffee mug, the handwritten thank you notes from patients who'd woken up because she'd been watching them sleep. She didn't cry until she was in her car. Then she cried like someone who'd been building a dam for 3 years and finally let it fail. At home, she sat at the kitchen table still wearing her scrubs, the rain-damp fabric clinging to her shoulders. Emma came home early from school. Some instinct had told her that Mom needed witnessing, that staying at school wouldn't be possible, and found her mother with tears streaming down her face like something had finally broken inside her. Emma's voice was small and frightened, and everything Margaret had tried to protect her from. "Oh, Mom, why are you home early? What happened?" Margaret couldn't find words that didn't reveal everything. She couldn't explain that she'd just performed an emergency procedure that saved a man's life and cost her own. She couldn't explain that the man she'd saved was the commanding officer of a son who died in a place called Helmand Province, and that some connections can't be unmade once they're made. She couldn't explain that her daughter was sitting next to a woman whose real rank wasn't a nurse but senior chief petty officer, and that the quiet had been the only thing keeping them both alive. So Margaret did what she'd done for 30 years. She said nothing. She held her daughter. And somewhere in Portland, in a hospital room on the 3rd floor of Sacred Heart, Captain James Holland was breathing because one woman had remembered how to save lives, consequences be damned, and that memory was about to change everything. What happened next didn't just change the hospital. It changed the entire city. And it started with the sound of helicopter rotors. By morning, Dr. Sterling's phone was already ringing. Board members who golfed at his club, hospital administrators who owed him favors, people whose children had gone to medical school on Sterling's recommendations. He sat in his office at 6 a.m., coffee cooling on his desk, voice calm and measured as a surgeon discussing a difficult case. "I need you to understand the severity of this situation," he told Dr. Reeves on the other end of the line. "An unlicensed individual performed an invasive procedure in my hospital. A pericardiocentesis. On a critical patient. We're talking about credentialing violations, potential assault charges, malpractice exposure." The lies came out smooth as silk. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Power doesn't shout, power whispers in the right ears, and by 7 a.m., 3 board members had committed to an emergency meeting. Sterling hung up and dialed Margaret's references next. The nursing supervisor from her first job, a director from a clinic she'd worked at briefly 5 years ago. He had their numbers from her personnel file, sitting in front of him like puzzle pieces waiting to be arranged. "I'm just verifying some employment history," he said to the first one, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "There are significant gaps in her timeline. Unexplained absences. Periods she didn't list at all. Can you explain where she was between 2009 and 2012? The woman hesitated. I'm not sure what you're asking." Sterling leaned in, voice dropping. "Were there any questions about her mental stability? Anything in her file suggesting she might have had a breakdown?" The reference was vague, defensive. Perfect. Sterling had what he needed: confusion, doubt, reasonable questions that would sound damning in a report. He called an investigator next, a woman named Cynthia Moss who specialized in credentialing audits. Cost him $4,000. "I need a full background check," he said. "Focus on her nursing license. Look for falsifications, inconsistencies, anything that suggests she doesn't have the credentials she claims to have." By noon, Margaret's badge was deactivated. Sterling had submitted a formal complaint to the hospital's credentialing committee citing unauthorized performance of critical medical procedures and material inconsistencies in employment documentation. The language was clinical, damning, and technically accurate enough to sound legitimate. Security was called. 2 guards in dark uniforms appeared at the nurse's station with an escort form signed by Sterling and the chief medical officer, a man Sterling had once saved from a malpractice lawsuit by testifying in his favor. The CMO hadn't asked questions. He'd just signed. Margaret was in room 312, checking a post-op patient's vitals, when she saw them walking toward her. She knew. The moment their eyes met, she knew. The room went dead silent. Other nurses stopped moving. A resident pretended to read charts. Everyone watched as security informed her that her access credentials had been revoked, effective immediately, and she was to collect her personal items and exit the building within 30 minutes. Margaret didn't argue. She didn't ask why. She simply nodded, finished documenting her patient's care with steady hands, and walked to her locker like a soldier following orders. The day shift watched her go. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound was the ventilator in room 310 wheezing its mechanical rhythm, steady and indifferent. She drove home in the rain. Her daughter Emma was waiting on the porch, lunch bag in hand, the same concerned expression she'd worn since the hospital called an hour earlier. Margaret sat at the kitchen table in her wet scrubs, water pooling beneath her feet, rain drumming against the window like a second heartbeat. Emma asked the only question that mattered, "Mom, are you okay?" Margaret couldn't answer. She'd spent 3 years building this quiet life, earning this identity as a simple nurse, and in one morning it had collapsed under the weight of a man's spite. She pressed her forehead against the cool table and let herself break, silently, efficiently, the way soldiers do when no one's watching. The kind of crying that doesn't make noise, just takes everything you have and leaves you hollow. 7 days passed. 7 days of Margaret not returning calls from her sister, not leaving the house, not changing out of her scrubs. She boxed up her belongings in her locker in her mind, already gone. The paperwork would come eventually. The formal termination. The investigation findings. Sterling would make sure those findings were damning enough that no hospital in Portland would hire her. She understood how this worked. You could be right and still lose. Competence didn't matter when power was arrayed against you. Then the sound came. A low thrum at first, barely audible over the rain that had settled into a constant drizzle. Margaret's daughter looked up from her laptop. "Is that?" The sound grew louder, a rhythmic pulse that made the windows vibrate. 3 Black Hawk helicopters, their rotors cutting the wet Portland air like surgical blades, descended towards Sacred Heart's rooftop helipad. Emergency protocol. Hospital lockdown procedure. Something was wrong. But it wasn't an emergency. It was a reckoning. A Pentagon officer strode through the main entrance at 2 p.m., dressed in dress uniform, flanked by 2 other military personnel and an FBI agent. They didn't go to the ER. They went directly to administration and asked one specific question: where is Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh? The words hung in the air like a held breath. Senior Chief. The title hit different when spoken aloud in a hospital lobby filled with staff who'd watched her scrub floors and insert fours without fanfare. Margaret was home, sitting at the kitchen table again, when her phone rang from an unknown number. "Ms. Walsh, this is Commander James Peterson from the Naval Special Warfare Command. I'm at Sacred Heart Hospital with a delegation from the Pentagon. I need you to come back to your workplace immediately." Not a request. A command. A voice used to giving orders and having them followed. Margaret's hands trembled, not with fear, but with a particular kind of adrenaline that comes from a life you thought was over suddenly demanding you return to it. She drove back in the rain. Her daughter Emma insisted on coming, still confused, still asking questions Margaret couldn't answer. They walked through Sacred Heart's main entrance at 2:11 p.m., and the lobby seemed to have assembled itself into a crowd. Nurses who'd watched her fired. Residents who'd heard Sterling's version of events. Administrators. The chief medical officer, his face pale. And standing in the center of it all, under the fluorescent lights that hummed their eternal fluorescent song, stood Commander Peterson holding a file folder thick enough to contain a life. "Senior Chief Walsh," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made the room smaller. Captain James Holland regained consciousness at 11:43 a.m. His first clear memory was of the woman who performed the emergency pericardiocentesis that kept him alive. When the surgical team was examining him, they found something. A military ID. An NCIS anchor tattooed on the wrist of the nurse who started his 4. Peterson opened the file. This file documents 3 tours in Helmand Province. Awards. Commendations. This file says you're the woman who walked into danger more times than most soldiers dream about. Emma's face went white. Her mother's voice, which Emma had heard as soft and deferential her entire life, had suddenly become something else entirely. The body language shifted. The spine straightened. 3 years of quiet erased. The battalion commander stepped forward, his uniform heavy with medals, his hands trembling as he read aloud, Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. 3 tours, Helmand Province. His voice cracked. 3 tours. A SEAL team leader, part of the Pentagon delegation, moved toward the assembled crowd. His voice carried like a weapon through the crowded atrium. Navy Cross for Valor. He paused. Every phone in the room was recording. Every eye was fixed on the woman in the faded scrubs. 2 silver stars. Another pause. Purple Heart. She pulled 11 men out of a kill zone under fire. 11. The words hit the air and didn't land, they exploded. Nurses gasped. The chief medical officer stepped backward. Dr. Sterling, who'd been standing near the back of the group, his face already beginning to understand what was happening, started moving toward the exit. The FBI agent cut him off. Dr. Conrad Sterling. Not a question. A statement. A name being read into the official record. We're here regarding your attempt to alter Senior Chief Walsh's service records in the VA database. Specifically, the modifications you initiated at 9:34 a.m. on March 14 using falsified credentials to access restricted military personnel files. Did you really think we wouldn't notice? The agent's voice was calm, professional, the voice of someone who had done this before. You access databases you have no clearance for. You attempted to modify federal records of a decorated military officer. That's not credentialing verification, Doctor. That's a federal crime. Sterling's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The handcuffs clicked onto his wrists with a sound like the final punctuation mark on his career. His face went red, not the controlled flush of embarrassment, but the bloated crimson of a man whose entire world was collapsing in real time. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His voice came out as a whisper, I was just verifying, the agent wasn't interested in explanations. Neither was anyone else. Security escorted him out, and the perp walk happened in slow motion past every person he'd ever lorded over. Past nurses he'd belittled. Past residents whose careers he'd threatened. Past the cafeteria where he'd knocked Margaret's tray to the floor. Someone in the crowd whispered "sweetheart" mockingly, and nervous laughter rippled through the staff, not cruel, but knowing. The laugh of people who understood they were watching karma arrive on schedule. Within 48 hours, Sterling's medical license was suspended. The DA's office filed federal charges, unauthorized access to government databases, attempted falsification of military records, obstruction of justice, targeting of a protected federal employee. His attorney negotiated a plea deal to avoid trial and prison time, guilty plea, $50,000 fine, permanent revocation of medical license, 5 years probation. The news ran the story for 3 days, prominent Portland doctor arrested for targeting veteran nurse. Sterling's wife filed for divorce. His country club revoked his membership. The only position his attorney could find him was teaching CPR certification courses at a community college, standing in front of bored students, making minimum wage, the kind of anonymous mediocrity he'd spent his entire career avoiding. The hospital settled with Margaret quietly. Full back pay for the week she'd been fired. Formal apology. Offer of reinstatement with a promotion to Director of Trauma Services. A new office overlooking the city. Her name on the door. Her past finally visible. 2 years later, Margaret stood on Sacred Heart's rooftop helipad, the same rooftop where 3 Black Hawks had landed to change her life. Wind from an incoming helicopter whipped her hair. She was Director of Trauma Services now, her hand steady on files instead of weapons, her identity finally aligned with her competence. Emma was finishing nursing school, understanding at last why her mother had disappeared into anonymity after the Navy, why she'd chosen silence over celebration. The helicopter descended, rotors beating a rhythm like applause. Captain James Holland stepped out in dress uniform, walking without assistance for the first time since his injury. He carried something in his hands, a framed unit patch. The same Ranger tab that had been sewn into his jacket lining before deployment. The one Margaret had stitched there before her son's last patrol, a mother's prayer hidden in seams. Holland's voice was thick when he spoke. Your son gave this to me. Told me his mother was the toughest medic in the Navy. If anything happened, I should keep it close. I didn't know it was you who sewed it in. You saved me twice, once in Helmand when you sent us prepared, and once here when I had nothing left. Margaret's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. The hospital CEO read a plaque aloud, the Margaret Walsh Trauma Center, in honor of a warrior who never stopped fighting for the wounded. Staff applauded. Nurses who'd watched her fired now watched her honored. Holland saluted one final time. The news crews packed up. Margaret returned to work, because that's what she does. She shows up. She saves lives. She asks for nothing in return. And sometimes, when the sun sets over Portland and her office is quiet, she thinks about a man teaching CPR to community college students for minimum wage, and she doesn't feel satisfied. She feels like she did her job. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of quiet warriors and public reckoning. Like this video if you believe the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you'd already survived?